You remember coming home to an empty house, the key on the string around your neck, still warm from your skin. You remember heating up a can of soup on a stove you weren't supposed to touch alone, standing on a step stool, completely fine with it. You had to be. You remember free range before anyone called it that, before it became a parenting philosophy, before it got a name, before it got a book deal. It was just Tuesday. It was just your life. You remember Judy Blume telling you more about your body than any adult in your life did. You remember health class being a film strip, literally a film strip, and the teacher leaving the room. You remember figuring out what a tampon was from a box under the bathroom cabinet. You remember that no one talked about any of it. You remember not needing them to. You remember being praised for not crying. You remember being called mature for your age, like it was the highest possible compliment. You remember the adults in your life saying it with relief, their relief, and feeling proud of yourself for making them feel that way. You remember the Challenger exploding on a television rolled into your classroom on a cart. You remember the teacher's face. You remember that no one processed it with you afterward. You remember going to lunch. You were 12 and understanding implicitly that you were not supposed to need things, that needing things was weakness, that weakness was dangerous, that you were going to be fine because you had no other available option. Here is the thing that needs to be said. That was not strength. That was a survival response, and you have been carrying it ever since. Framing the in-between. You are technically Generation X, born somewhere between 1965 and 1980, depending on which demographer you're reading, which year they decided to draw the line. The label exists, the research exists, the articles exist, but the label has never quite fit, has it? Because when people talk about Gen X, they talk about slackers, they talk about flannel and irony and Douglas Coupland, and a performative detachment that was itself a kind of aesthetic. They talk about the generation that didn't care, that checked out, that raised cynicism to an art form. They give you Kurt Cobain and reality bites and a shrug. And some of that is true for some people, but it is not the texture of your specific experience, because you are a Gen X woman, and that distinction matters enormously, and it has almost never been made. You exist in a gap, not between generations, but between two entirely incompatible sets of instructions. On one side, the world you were born into, which was still organized around the belief that women were primarily emotional, primarily domestic, primarily in need of management. On the other side, the world you were being told to prepare for, where you were going to work, support yourself, compete, achieve, succeed on the same terms as anyone. Those two worlds were never reconciled. Nobody reconciled them for you. The adults in your life had, in many cases, never reconciled them in themselves. So what happened is what always happens when two incompatible instructions are issued simultaneously to a child. You built your own solution, privately, without language for what you were doing. The solution you built was a particular kind of toughness, a self-sufficiency so complete it eventually stopped feeling like a coping mechanism and started feeling like a personality. A capacity to need almost nothing from almost anyone that you have at various points in your life been deeply proud of and also quietly devastated by. This video is about that specific toughness, where it came from, what it cost you, and what psychology has to say about the particular shape of the woman it built. The cultural architecture of tough. To understand where this came from, you have to understand the specific cultural architecture of your childhood. You were raised in the 1970s and 1980s, which means you were raised in the first full wave of second wave's feminism's cultural reach. The women's movement had happened. Free to be you and me had happened. Your mother had or was about to have a job, not a little job, a career maybe. And the message being sent to you explicitly or implicitly in every direction was you can do anything. You are not limited. The doors are open. There is nothing you cannot achieve. This was new. This was genuinely historically new, and it was a gift. But it came packaged with something that was not a gift, because you can do anything got translated in the cultural transmission between that message and your actual childhood into something subtly but crucially different.
It got translated into "you don't need anything." Strength became the point, self-sufficiency became the measure. Needing help, expressing distress, showing vulnerability, these were reframed as leftovers from the old world, relics of the kind of woman you were not going to be. You absorbed this. Of course you absorbed this. You were a child. Children absorb everything.
And the absorption happened across multiple registers simultaneously. It happened in your home, where the adults around you were, in many cases, themselves figuring out what the new rules were, often while managing their own unprocessed emotional material from childhoods that had been even less emotionally attuned than yours. It happened in your school, where girls who cried were a problem and girls who competed were celebrated. It happened in your media, in the movies, in the television, in the books, where the heroines who survived were the ones who didn't break. Think about the female role models you were given. Think about what they all had in common. They were competent, they were capable, they pushed through, they did not stop to feel things in the middle. You internalize this not as a conscious decision, but as the most logical available response to the world as you found it. The psychology of emotional suppression in girls. Here is what psychology has to say about that. In 1990, developmental psychologist Leslie R. Brody published foundational research on gender differences in emotional expression and what she called display rules, the implicit social scripts that govern which emotions are acceptable to express and for whom. Brody's work, particularly her later synthesis in Gender, Emotion, and the Family, 1999, documented something specific, that girls in Western cultures receive consistent, systematic training in emotional concealment of negative emotion beginning in early childhood, even while being simultaneously praised for emotional sensitivity and relational attunement. The double bind is important. You were not told to stop feeling, you were told to stop showing. You were told to be perceptive about other people's feelings and largely silent about your own. You were told that reading the room was a skill and filling the room was a burden. What this created in girls who were also receiving the "you are strong, you can do anything" instruction of your specific cultural moment was a particularly ironclad version of emotional suppression, not just the ordinary gender display rules that have always existed, but those display rules compounded by the new instruction that needing, wanting, struggling, hurting were specifically incompatible with the new identity you were being asked to build. You did not have a tantrum at 12. You were not that kind of girl. You were instead the kind of girl who got quieter when something was wrong, more efficient, more capable, more competent in direct proportion to how distressed you actually were. This is not a criticism. This is an accurate description of what an intelligent child does when the available feedback tells her that distress is not only unwelcome, but inconsistent with the self she is being formed around. But Leslie Brody's research points to something with a long tail. The capacity to suppress emotional expression does not eliminate the emotional experience, it relocates it. It drives it somewhere internal, somewhere that doesn't have ready language, somewhere that expresses itself not as crying or asking for help, but as physical symptoms, as diffuse anxiety, as a persistent low-grade sense that something is wrong, that cannot be named, because naming it would require admitting it existed. You know this feeling. You have probably had it for decades. You may have thought it was a personality trait. It is not a personality trait. It is the long shadow of a training. But there is something more specific to your cohort that needs naming, and it has to do with the particular conditions of your after-school hours. You were, statistically, far more likely than any previous generation of girls to come home to an empty house. The latchkey phenomenon was real, was large, and has been substantially under-examined in terms of its psychological impact, particularly for girls. Research by sociologists Sandra Hofferth and colleagues in the late 1980s and early 1990s documented that by 1985, approximately 2.1 million children between the ages of 5 and 13 were caring for themselves after school with no adult supervision. The number grew throughout the decade.
These were not children in crisis, these were children in a new normal. A normal that had not been designed, not been chosen, not been accompanied by preparation or language or emotional infrastructure. For boys, the research on Latchkey experience showed mixed effects. For girls, something more specific happened. Psychologist Deborah Belle, in her 1999 book, The After-School Lives of Children, documented that girls in self-care situations showed a distinctive pattern. They became highly competent at managing the practical demands of unsupervised time, while simultaneously developing what Belle called precocious maturity, an accelerated adoption of adult responsibility schemas that bypassed normal developmental stages of dependence and interdependence. Precocious maturity. Sit with that phrase. It means you learned to be an adult before you were one, not in a romantic Little Women sense, in a neurological, relational, and emotional sense. You learned to regulate yourself, your schedule, your needs, your fears, without external scaffolding, because the external scaffolding was not present. And because you learned to do this so young and so successfully, the scaffolding you eventually needed as an adult, the permission to ask for help, the capacity to receive care, the ability to let someone else be the competent one, never fully developed.
You learned early that you were the person who handled things. You have spent your entire adult life being the person who handles things, not because you chose it, because it was installed. The divorce decade. Here is the more consequential piece. You grew up during the divorce decade, not a metaphor, a documented statistical reality. The divorce rate in the United States peaked in 1979-1980 at roughly 5.3 divorces per 1,000 people, the highest it has ever been in American history. If you were born in the late 1960s or early 1970s, there is approximately a 50% statistical chance that your parents divorced during your childhood or adolescence. And even if they didn't, even if your household stayed intact, you grew up surrounded by the evidence of instability. Your friends' parents divorced, your relatives divorced. The cultural narrative shifted, loudly and visibly around you. Marriage was no longer a permanent structure. The family was no longer a guaranteed container. What does a child do with that information, particularly a girl who has already been trained that needing is weakness and that she can handle things? She concludes, below the level of conscious reasoning, that the only reliable container is herself. This is what psychotherapist Terry Real, in his work on relational psychology, has described as adaptive child patterning. The adaptive coping strategies developed in response to environmental instability that become, in adulthood, the primary way of moving through the world, even when the original instability is long gone. Real's research, synthesized in I Don't Want to Talk About It, 1997, and expanded in subsequent work, makes the case that adaptive coping in childhood is inherently conservative, meaning it locks in at the point of formation and resists updating even when the environment changes. You adapted. You adapted brilliantly. You became someone who could manage, someone who didn't need the container because she had become the container. And that worked for a very long time in a lot of situations. It genuinely worked. But there was a cost that does not appear on the balance sheet of competence. The cost is this: if you were the container, you cannot be held. If you are the one who handles things, there is no one to handle things for you. If your instinct every time something is painful or hard or too much is to manage it rather than feel it, then you have been managing rather than living for a significant portion of your adult life. And some part of you knows this. Some part of you has known this for a long time. What tough actually looks like in an adult woman. Let's be specific, because the word tough sounds simple, and the reality is not simple at all. Tough in the adult woman you became does not look like what people picture when they hear the word. It does not look like hardness or coldness or imperviousness. You are not those things. You are in many cases deeply perceptive about other people's emotional states.
Brody's research predicted this exactly. The sensitivity was never removed, it was only redirected outward. Tough, for you, looks like this. It looks like being the most competent person in almost every room you enter and feeling faintly resentful about it in a way you rarely let yourself fully name. It looks like finding it nearly impossible to ask for help, not because you are too proud to ask, but because some pre-verbal part of you genuinely does not believe that asking will produce anything useful. It looks like interpreting care from other people as a potential trap or burden because you have been trained to associate need with vulnerability and vulnerability with danger. It looks like running at full capacity for so long that you cannot accurately assess your own level of depletion. It looks like saying you're fine when you are manifestly not fine, and then, when pressed, meaning it, because you have lost the internal signal that would tell you otherwise. It looks like your body sending the signals your emotions have been prohibited from sending, the chronic tension, the disrupted sleep, the digestive issues that doctors can't fully explain, the exhaustion that rest does not resolve. It looks like relationships, romantic, platonic, professional, in which you are disproportionately the giver, the organizer, the manager, the one who tracks everyone else's needs, not because you want to be in that role, because it is the only role that feels safe. Giving is safe, receiving is uncertain, managing is controllable. Being managed involves surrender, and surrender was never on the menu. This is a complicated relationship with success. You have worked hard, you have achieved, you have been, by measurable external standards, capable and competent and often excellent, and you have frequently felt, underneath all of it, a kind of hollow dissatisfaction you couldn't name, because the instruction, be strong, be capable, succeed, was never followed by an instruction about what you were allowed to want for yourself. This is not a crisis, it is not pathology, it is the entirely predictable outcome of a very specific training in a very specific historical moment, administered to very specific girls by adults who themselves were operating from incomplete information.
The mother question. Here is where it gets difficult and where it needs to be said directly. Many of you had mothers who were doing something genuinely extraordinary. Your mothers were, in many cases, the first generation of women in their families to hold careers, to leave marriages, to refuse arrangements that had constrained every woman before them. This was real. This was important. This was, in many ways, a gift they were trying to give you. But they were doing it in conditions of enormous personal stress, with almost no support systems designed for what they were attempting, in a culture that was alternately celebrating and punishing them for the attempt. They were, in many cases, exhausted. They were, in many cases, isolated. They were, in many cases, managing their own grief and anger and ambivalence about what their lives had become, and they did not have language for any of it, because no one had given them language for it either. And so, what got transmitted, not by malice, not by failure of love, but through the particular mechanism of emotional contagion that developmental psychologist Carolyn Zahn-Wachsler has documented extensively, was this: do not add to the weight. Handle yourself. Be the kind of girl who does not need to be worried about. Zahn-Wachsler's research, published across several decades beginning in the 1970s, demonstrated that children, daughters especially, show a pronounced capacity for what she called empathic over-arousal, taking on the emotional states of caregivers as their own, responding to parental distress not with distress of their own, but with caregiving behavior, becoming the emotional managers of relationships in which they were the child. You learn to read your mother. You learn to manage around her limits. You learn to be the version of yourself that would not be an additional burden in a life that already had enough burden in it. And then you spent your adulthood in relationships doing the same thing, reading the room, managing around limits, being the version of yourself that would not require too much. This is not your mother's fault. This is not your fault. This is what children do when the environment asks it of them. But it has a cost,
And the cost is that the practice of self-erasure, the constant subordination of your own emotional needs to the management of someone else's, can become so habitual that you no longer experience it as a loss. You call it being good in a relationship. You call it being understanding. You call it being easy. You call it not being needy. What it actually is, a dissociation from your own interior experience so practiced and so complete that you have largely stopped registering it as a loss. The needy word. Let's stay with that word for a moment. Needy. This word has done enormous damage to women of your generation. Enormous, specific, targeted damage, and it is worth examining directly. Needy is not a psychological term. It is a social control mechanism. It is what happens when the ordinary human requirement for connection, attunement, emotional responsiveness, and care gets labeled as pathological in women specifically, in contexts where expressing it would inconvenience the people around them. Children have needs. Adults have needs. All humans have needs. The research on attachment, beginning with John Bowlby's foundational work and elaborated by decades of researchers, including Carolyn Main's adult attachment interview research, produced some of the most important documentation of how childhood attachment patterns manifest in adult relationships, is not ambiguous on this point. Emotional needs are not a weakness. They are a biological given. They are the infrastructure of human bonding. What your training did was not eliminate your needs. It is not possible to eliminate needs. What it did was teach you to experience your own needs as dangerous, as evidence of inadequacy, as proof of the thing you were most afraid of being, too much. And here is the cruelest part of that training. It worked in reverse. The more successfully you hid your needs from others and eventually from yourself, the more you attracted people and situations that confirmed the original lesson, because people who are drawn to self-sufficient women are often people who are themselves not equipped to meet emotional needs, and so the relationship would unfold, and at some point, your actual needs would surface. The need for reciprocity, for attunement, for someone to occasionally be the competent one, and the response would confirm the original fear. You were too much. You needed too much. You were needy. The wound reproduced itself. The body keeps the account. There is a body dimension to this that cannot be skipped, because the emotional suppression that was trained into you did not vanish. It migrated, and it migrated specifically into the body in patterns that physician and trauma researcher Bessel van der Kolk documented in his foundational research beginning in the 1980s and synthesized in The Body Keeps the Score, 2014. Van der Kolk's central argument that traumatic and chronically stressful experience is stored somatically in the nervous system, in the body's automatic responses, in ways that bypass cognitive processing, has specific and direct application to your experience.
The stress of your formation was real, not dramatic, not what anyone would call trauma in the clinical, acute sense, but chronic, sustained. The ordinary stress of a child who was managing too much, feeling too little permission to acknowledge it, operating with the implicit knowledge that the container she depended on was uncertain or absent. That stress load was carried somewhere. For many Gen X women, it was carried in the body. The rates of autoimmune conditions, fibromyalgia, chronic fatigue, and stress-related somatic conditions are significantly elevated in middle-aged women. Research is ongoing about the precise mechanisms, but what is not contested is the relationship between chronic stress, emotional suppression, and immune and nervous system dysregulation. Your body was keeping the account when your mind was not permitted to. What the gap between generations produced. Here is something that has never been said clearly enough about Gen X women specifically. You were the first full generation of girls to receive simultaneously the feminist instruction and the emotional suppression instruction, and to receive them not as contradictions but as a single package, because the cultural message was not, in fact, be strong and feel your feelings. The cultural message was be strong instead of feeling your feelings.
The feelings were associated with the old version of womanhood, the strength was associated with the new one. This is historically specific. The generation before you, the women who grew up in the 1950s and early 1960s, received the emotional suppression instruction too, but without the feminist permission to be competent and capable and professionally ambitious. They were told to suppress feelings in service of compliance. They were told to be pleasant and accommodating and not too much. They were sad in specific, legible ways. The generation after you, millennial women, received a different version. They got therapy speak. They got the language of boundaries and needs and self-care. They got, at minimum, a cultural permission structure for acknowledging emotional experience, even if they didn't always use it. You got neither. You got the strength without the language. You got the ambition without the permission to struggle. You got the instruction to exceed and the simultaneous instruction to be fine about it. You exist in this gap not just between generations, but between two eras of what was permissible for women. You absorbed the new permission to compete without being given the new permission to need. You are post-housewife and pre-therapy. You are post-submission and pre-boundaries. You were in the middle of a cultural transition that nobody had fully theorized yet, being formed by it in real time. And here is what that produced: a generation of women who are extraordinarily capable and quietly starving. Capable in ways that are genuinely impressive, in problem-solving, in resilience, in the ability to function under pressure, in the capacity to carry enormous loads without complaint. Starving for the acknowledgement that the load was enormous, for someone, from anyone, to put it down. The cost itemized. Let's name the cost specifically because it deserves to be named. The cost is not a single thing, it is several things, and they have compounded over time. The cost in relationships. Intimacy requires vulnerability, not as a preference but as a structural requirement. There is no other mechanism by which two people become genuinely close. Vulnerability requires the capacity to be seen in your need, your difficulty, your imperfection. If your training prohibited that, if need was reframed as weakness and weakness as danger, then intimacy has always been available to you only at a fraction of its actual depth. You can be present in a relationship. You can be giving in a relationship. You can be genuinely loving in a relationship. But to be known, to allow someone full access to the interior of your experience, including the parts that are not managing, not fine, not competent, that has been for many of you the one thing that remains just out of reach. Not because you don't want it, because every time you approach it, the old training fires. Don't be needy. Don't be too much. Handle it. The cost in self-knowledge. There is a particular kind of self-ignorance that results not from lack of intelligence, but from long practice in not looking. You are in many ways highly self-aware. You have had to be because reading your environment accurately was a survival skill from very early on. But that awareness has been largely directed outward, inward in the specific territory of your own emotional needs, your own desires, your own sense of what you actually want as opposed to what you are good at, what you're capable of, what is expected of you. The map has been underdeveloped. Many Gen X women arrive in midlife with a highly sophisticated understanding of everyone around them and a genuine uncertainty about who they themselves are underneath the competence.
The cost in health. Already addressed above, but it bears repeating in this context. The body is not separate from the cost. The somatic load of decades of emotional suppression is real and measurable. If you are in midlife and your body is asking for something different, for rest, for softness, for a different pace, it is not betraying you. It is asking, finally, to be attended to. The cost in joy. This one is harder to name, but it is perhaps the heaviest. When you were trained to be strong, to need nothing, to handle everything, joy was quietly deprioritized along with everything else. Not pleasure. Pleasure was available, but joy, the specific experience of allowing yourself to receive something good, to be fully present in a moment of happiness without immediately calculating how to maintain it or protect it or earn it, that requires a groundedness in the present moment that the anxious management mode does not permit. You may have decades of competence on your record and a much thinner record of genuine inhabitable delight. The midlife signal. Here is something about where you are now. If you are reading this in midlife, and many of you are in the specific developmental moment that psychologist Terry Apter, in her research on women's adult development, published in Secret Paths, Women in the New Midlife, 1995, described as a window, not a crisis, a window. Apter's research on women in their late 30s through 50s found a pattern that contradicted the cultural narrative of midlife crisis as loss. What she documented was something more specific, a period of heightened authenticity in which women who had spent their earlier adult lives performing competence, managing others' expectations, and suppressing their own needs began, sometimes urgently, sometimes quietly, to reclaim the interior life they had set aside. This is not a crisis, it is a reclamation, and it is, for Gen X women specifically, the moment at which the cost of the training finally becomes visible enough to work with. The signal looks different for different people. For some, it is a relationship ending or changing. For some, it is a health event that cannot be managed away. For some, it is the departure of children, or the death of a parent, or the sudden absence of a role that had been organizing the self for so long that without it, the question surfaces, who exactly am I? For some, it is just a quiet, persistent knowing that the way you have been operating is no longer sustainable, not dramatically unsustainable, just you are tired in a way that sleep doesn't fix, and you are successful in ways that don't satisfy, and you are strong in ways that are starting to feel less like assets and more like armor you don't know how to take off. If that resonates, it is the window opening, not closing. What psychology calls this? There is a term in clinical psychology that applies here, and it deserves to be introduced carefully rather than thrown like a diagnosis. The term is alexithymia. It comes from the Greek without, lexis, words, thymos, feeling, without words for feeling. Alexithymia is not a disorder in the clinical sense. It exists on a continuum. It refers to a difficulty identifying and describing one's own emotional states, not an absence of emotion, but an absence of ready access to the emotional signal, a disconnection between the felt experience and the language for it. Research by psychologist Graham Taylor, whose work with Michael Bagby and James Parker produced the Toronto Alexithymia Scale in the 1980s and 1990s, the most widely used assessment tool for this construct, found that alexithymia is not innate. It is, in significant part, learned. It develops in environments where emotional expression is discouraged, where emotional needs are met with dismissal or discomfort, where children learn to intellectualize rather than feel because feeling carries social costs. This is not a clinical description you are likely to use to describe yourself. You do not feel emotionally numb. You feel things. You feel things intensely in many cases, but you may have noticed that the path from something is wrong to I can articulate what is wrong and why and what I need is longer for you than it seems to be for other people, that the emotions arrive in the body before they arrive in language, that when someone asks how you feel, your first response is often an analysis rather than a description. That is not a character flaw. That is the installed result of a training. And the distance between something is wrong and I can advocate for what I need, that distance can be shortened, not through willpower, through practice, through the gradual, patient, consistent act of paying attention to your interior experience and refusing to immediately manage it. The compound effect of being overlooked. There is one more layer that needs to be named. Gen X women have been, as a group, disproportionately overlooked in public conversation. This is not a grievance, it is an observation with psychological relevance. The boomers before you got the cultural spotlight, the think pieces, the prestige, the retrospective valorization. The millennials after you got the cultural obsession, the constant analysis, the study upon study, the constant diagnosis, the discourse.
You got nothing much. A shrug, essentially. Your specific cultural and psychological formation, its particular pressures, its particular costs, its particular gifts, has rarely been examined with any depth or care.
This means that the psychological experience you have been carrying, the very specific architecture of how it was built and what it cost, has largely been unnamed in public culture. Unnamed things are harder to address. They are harder to recognize as specific and historical rather than simply personal. They are harder to distinguish from character, from fate, from just the way you are. The experience of being unaddressed by the culture that formed you is its own kind of injury. It is the injury of the implied message, your experience was not interesting enough to examine. Your specific formation was not significant enough to name. It was. It is. And the naming matters. Not because naming something fixes it, but because named things can be worked with. Named things can be seen clearly. Named things can be distinguished from the self so that the self can choose what to do with them. The reframe. Here is what that actually built. Everything described above, the precocious maturity, the emotional suppression, the self-sufficiency, the management mode, the capacity to operate under pressure without external scaffolding, has a shadow. That shadow has been the subject of everything in this video so far. But shadows are cast by substance, and the substance is real. You developed a form of emotional intelligence that is relatively rare, not the kind of emotional intelligence that is about feeling freely and expressing openly. That is the kind that gets praised in therapeutic culture, and that has genuinely a different set of gifts. The kind you developed is the intelligence of the careful observer. You read rooms, you read people, you track the emotional temperature of a situation with accuracy that borders on clinical because you were trained to do it from early childhood when that reading was a practical necessity. You developed a tolerance for ambiguity that the research consistently identifies as one of the most significant predictors of adaptive functioning in adult life. Psychologist Paul Sylvia, in his research on epistemic curiosity, and Nassim Taleb's work on anti-fragility, different traditions, same finding, converge on the point that people who learned early to navigate uncertain environments without complete information develop a cognitive and emotional flexibility that is genuinely difficult to acquire in adulthood. You have it. You developed what might best be called structural resilience. Not the pop psychology kind that is really just optimism rebranded. Actual resilience, the capacity to absorb disruption without complete dysregulation, to continue functioning under conditions that derailed people who had more consistent and protected developmental environments. This is not nothing. In a world that is increasingly uncertain, increasingly unstable, increasingly resistant to the kind of planning and prediction that calmer eras permitted, this capacity is not a relic, it is an asset. You developed a particular quality of presence with people in pain. Because you have carried difficulty quietly for a long time, you know something about it that people who have been more openly supported often do not know. You know that the need to be fixed is often less urgent than the need to be witnessed. You know that the most useful thing in a room where someone is suffering is frequently not advice, not solutions, not even comfort, but accurate, unfrightened acknowledgement. You learned from long practice not to be frightened by difficulty. That makes you, in moments that matter, an extraordinary person to be near. These are not consolation prizes. They are not well at least statements, the kind that dismiss everything that came before them. They are the actual, documented, real capacities that your specific formation built. The cost was real. The capacity is also real. Both things are true. And the work of this particular season of your life is not to pretend the cost wasn't what it was. It is to recognize that you are not only the cost, you are also what survived it, what was built by it, what is still being built. What would it mean to put down the armor? Not the competence, not the intelligence, not the capacity. Those do not go away when the armor comes off. They are structural at this point. They are bone, not clothing. The armor is something different. The armor is the constant anticipation of having to manage alone, the preemptive self-sufficiency that kicks in before anyone has had the chance to show up.
the reflexive minimization of your own experience that happens before you've even assessed what the experience actually is. The way you already have the answer to "I'm fine" on your lips before the question is asked. Putting it down looks like this: practicing, slowly and deliberately, the act of registering your own emotional experience before you manage it. Not instead of managing it, before, 5 minutes before. The pause between "something is wrong" and "I will now handle this thing that is wrong." In that pause, what is actually there? What does it actually feel like? What does it actually need?
This is not therapy speak. This is not self-help. This is the basic act of attending to the interior that your training interrupted, and that can, at any point, including this one, be relearned. Putting it down also looks like practicing, and this word is deliberate because it is a practice, not a switch. Asking for help before you need it desperately, before you are so depleted that the ask comes out as collapse rather than as request. The ask, practiced regularly in small contexts, gradually becomes available in larger ones. The muscle develops. It looks like permitting yourself to receive care without converting it immediately into management. When someone does something for you and the reflex is to immediately reciprocate, to equalize, to make sure you own nothing, notice that reflex. Not to suppress it, just to notice it, just to register the discomfort of being on the receiving end of care without immediately discharging it. The discomfort is information. The discomfort is where the work is. And it looks like this: permitting yourself to be a person with a history. Your formation was specific, it was real, it shaped you in real ways, with real costs. You are allowed to know that. You are allowed to grieve the parts of yourself that the training foreclosed. The girl who needed things and was trained out of it. The woman who was capable but rarely held. The version of you that learned to be the container because no one taught her that she was allowed to be held. Grief is not weakness. In the specific emotional architecture you were built with, grief is one of the most demanding things you can do. Because grief requires the admission that something was lost, and your entire training was aimed at building a self that did not acknowledge losses, that kept moving, that was fine. You don't have to be fine. You have been fine for a long time. You have been fine enough for all the people who needed you to be fine. You have been fine in rooms where the cost of not fine was too high to pay. In this room, right now, being fine is optional. Here is what you are. You are a woman who was formed in a specific crucible, at a specific historical moment, by forces that were genuinely unprecedented and genuinely contradictory, by adults who are doing their best with incomplete information in a world that was changing faster than anyone's emotional vocabulary could keep up with. You are a woman who learned to handle things because handling things was what the situation required, and you were intelligent enough and capable enough to do it. You are a woman who was not broken by that, who was not defined by that, who is not finished being formed by whatever is still ahead. You are also a woman who is allowed at this point to want more than survival, more than competence, more than being the person who handles it. The capacity for depth, for genuine intimacy, for inhabitable joy, for the kind of rest that actually replenishes is not gone. It was not removed. It was put aside. It is still there, underneath the management, underneath the armor, underneath the automatic "I'm fine." It has been waiting with considerable patience for you to decide it was safe to come back. It is safe. Not because everything is resolved, not because the world has become reliable, but because you have enough practice, enough evidence, enough history with yourself to know you can feel things and still stand. You can need things and still be capable. You can put the weight down for a moment and nothing catastrophic will happen. You built a self that could survive anything. That is extraordinary. That is genuinely, historically extraordinary. Now you get to find out what that self wants to live. If this finally named something you've been carrying, the next video goes directly into a part of this generation's psychology that almost nobody has addressed directly, the specific grief of Gen X women who spent their 30s performing okayness and are only now beginning to calculate the real cost. Subscribe so you don't miss it.